Lynette, you're on mute. Hear me?
Morning, Julian. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry about that, everybody. I came into the office on the assumption that my connection to WebEx would be smoother and quicker, but it obviously wasn't. But never mind. We're only about a minute overdue, so hopefully everybody's okay.
Okay. Thanks for that. I guess we're all in a fairly brave new world here in terms of these get-togethers. So apologies for any slight flies in the ointment that we might encounter this morning in the next hour or so. Sorry, excuse me. So that said, without further ado, again, welcome to the Shoesmith's Breakfast Seminar. My name is Julian Richards. I'm a pensions partner in the London office. Well, working from home currently, obviously, as we all are, but a partner in the pensions team in the London office. And my colleague, Lynette Lewis, who you'll also see on the screen, who's co-hosting, is a partner in the pensions team based in the Birmingham office. And as you'll see, she's actually in the Birmingham office rather than sitting as I am in my home office, aka the spare bedroom. So apologies for the backdrop on that. Those of you that have attended our pensions breakfast briefings before, we normally run a couple of briefings every year in a selection of our offices. We'll know that we were intending to do so this year, but obviously we have been somewhat overtaken by events, and therefore we've taken the decision, rather than to simply cancel, to transmute into virtual form and do the presentation via a webinar. So we hope that works for you. Welcome this morning, and hopefully you will get as much out of the webinar session as you would have done if we'd have been there in person, apart from the fact you'll have to make your own tea and bring your own biscuits. Apologies for that, we couldn't do that virtually. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, if I may, per the first slide. We're all no doubt becoming increasingly familiar with the rules of engagement, as it were, for webinars and virtual meetings over the last few weeks. But before we start, a few points to note. As you come into the webinar, all delegates will be muted. That's not because we're being rude, but simply to try and avoid any background noise and particularly any feedback that we can get through people's systems. So you'll be muted, but as always, as with all our briefings and meetings, we do encourage you to ask questions, and the Q&A chat box gives you the ability to do so whilst you're muted. So if your cursor around, I'm sure you're all familiar with doing this, much more so than I, but there's a little icon at the bottom of the screen that looks like a little speech bubble. You click on that, your chat box will come up on the right-hand side, and you can type in your questions there. Please make sure that you'll select that you're sending the question to everyone, not simply to the host or one of the presenters, please. So you select the all box, and we'll have some time for questions at the end, but we will try and pick up as appropriate some of the questions as they come up during the presentation. So please do ask questions as we go through. Lynette and I will be splitting the presentation between us. I'll do the initial couple of slides and pick up one or two of the issues in the bill, and then we hand over to Lynette to go through the final few slides in the presentation. Those that have attended our breakfast briefings before will note that we're taking a slightly different approach this year, not just in virtual format, but actually in terms of topics and subject matter. We normally look at a range of current issues that are affecting the pensions world, but we've decided to take a slightly different approach this year, which is or the first of our seminars this year, which is to look specifically on one, albeit fairly broad issue, which is the issue of the new pension schemes bill 2021. Why? Well, regardless of the situation we now find ourselves in, it's clear that this is a key piece of legislation, and it's going to be a focus of our attention when we get, well, at the moment and increasingly when we get back to some kind of normality in the future, whether you're a trustee, an employer, or an advisor, whether you work with DB schemes or DC schemes or both, this is going to be an important bit of legislation with some key impacts on us. So whilst the bill is still progressing through Parliament at the moment, we thought we would take this opportunity to try and bring you up to date as much as possible on where the bill is, what its contents are, and importantly, what the implications may be for you. That we've been waiting for some of the provisions in this bill for quite some time now, and there are some important issues to address, some of which I appreciate may change as the bill progresses through Parliament, but nonetheless, we think the meat is on the bones at the moment, and there will be something to think about as we progress over the next few months. Sorry, excuse me. So what will we be covering this morning? I'm not entirely sure if I'm supposed to be, sorry, bear with me 1 second. A bit behind on my slides, apologies. So what will we be covering this morning? Well, we'll look at a little bit of background to the bill. How did we get here? We will look at the key contents in the bill. It's a fairly large piece of legislation, but there are some key issues which we'll be picking up on. In particular, CDC schemes, collective defined contribution schemes, we know them, the pensions dashboard, DB scheme funding, including the regulator's new code, potentially funding code consultation. It's delayed as indeed everything is at the moment, but nonetheless we'll be looking at that. And briefly, some changes to the transfer rules and a little bit on PPF compensation. Excuse me while I fiddle about with my camera. And then some commentary from us on headlines and criticisms that the bill has attracted as it's progressed both through its consultation, initial consultation stage, and then through the, as it is currently, House of Lords before it goes back into the House of Commons. Then at the end, there'll obviously be time for, as I said, some questions which, in addition to those that have been asked through the presentation, you may want to put in at that point. So, excuse me, how do we get here? Well, we've addressed the pension schemes bill in a number of our previous seminars, but just by way of background and lead into some of the issues that we'll be talking about this morning, as you recall, there was a white paper issued in March of 2018 in the wake of some fairly high-profile corporate failures. Companies such as BHS and Carillion got fairly short shrift, occasionally perhaps unfairly, but the regulator perhaps unfairly got some criticism from Frank Field, the DWP Select Committee, and in the press about the way in which the regulator had been involved in those corporate failures and the way in which its powers were structured and its indeed failure to use those powers. So the white paper was initiated in March 2018, and following that there was a DWP consultation document called Protecting Defined Benefit Pension Schemes, a Stronger Pensions Regulator, and that's a theme that flows through the draft pension schemes bill, and particularly some of the issues that Lynette will be picking up later on in this presentation. And the white paper proposed changes to existing notifiable events regime, a new fine system for management of DB schemes, and in particular amendments to the regulator's anti-avoidance powers. Proposed action points were then set out in response to that consultation in February last year, February 2019. But because of the structure of those proposals, particularly the regulator's powers, primary legislation was needed. These weren't changes that could be enacted through secondary legislation under existing acts. So hence we've had the pension scheme bill drafted and been waiting some time for it to progress through Parliament. You'll recall that what seems like a very long time ago now, back in October last year, the pension schemes bill was announced as part by the Queen in the Queen's speech as part of the government's legislative priorities for the 2019-2020 parliamentary session. It was published on 16th of October, but again, as we recall, Parliament was dissolved for the general election in December last year, and it was put on pause. It was then republished and reintroduced in substantially the same format in January of this year, and had its first reading in the House of Lords, second reading in 28th of January, and went through to the committee stage of the House of Lords by the end of February and the beginning of March. Unfortunately, it's kind of becoming the unluckiest bit of legislation in some time. The progress of the bill is now stalled again because of everything that the government is having to deal with the current pandemic crisis. The bill was expected to reach House of Lords, House of Commons by Easter, but it didn't happen before the parliamentary recess. And now, whilst Parliament has reopened on the 21st of April, it's being done in a kind of hybrid manner, as I'm sure you've seen on the news and read about in the media, which means that some MPs are attending chamber, some MPs are attending by video link, and even following that, the sitting of Parliament, sitting with the House of Commons, is now moved to 3 days a week for the foreseeable future. So there's going to be that and virus-related legislation to deal with. There's going to be a fairly considerable delay for non-virus-related legislation, including this bill. So we've been waiting for some time. Unfortunately, it looks like we're going to be waiting for quite a bit longer for the bill to progress, or certainly much longer than we initially thought would be the case when it was introduced at the end of 2019. So just very quickly, the timeline of events, as I say, the bill was introduced to the House of Lords in January and had its second reading there. A number of amendments have been laid in February and March, some of which we'll be discussing later. The end of February and beginning of March had its committee stage, and during that time we had some illustrative regulations on collective defined contribution schemes. We now wait to hear what the remainder of the timing for the remainder of the passage of the bill will be. It needs to go through its third reading in the House of Lords before it enters the Commons. As I say, that was due to happen by Easter, but that's not going to happen now, obviously. And then there's another 5 stages to go through before it will be given royal assent. So it's now going to be sometime in 2020, or expected to be sometime in 2021, before the bill is finally completes its course through Parliament and becomes an act following royal assent. So potter's history there. That's what the meaning, so the intention behind the bill has been, and that's the progress it's making, fairly slow and tortuous for reasons outside of, unusually perhaps for pensions legislation, for reasons outside of the content of the bill, necessarily for reasons outside of everyone's control. So just headlining some of the things that are going to be, or that are contained that make up the bill, and then we'll be picking these up in more detail as we go through this morning's presentation. Part 1 sets out it's a bill split into 5 parts. Part 1 sets out the legislative framework to establish and operate collective money purchase schemes. The nomenclature, I suppose, is slightly confused. We colloquially know them now as CDC schemes, collective defined contribution schemes. In the bill, they're called collective money purchase schemes. So apologies if I switch between the two for no apparent reason. And part 2 does the same effect, but for for legislation in Northern Ireland. Excuse me. Part 3 of the bill strengthens the powers of the pensions regulator, including establishing new criminal offences and financial penalties, and making changes to the contribution notice, financial support direction, and corporate transaction oversight regimes. Part 4 sets out the legislative framework for pensions dashboards to define what the dashboard, a qualifying dashboard service is, and the requirements that will need to be met by potential providers. And it also provides for MAPS, the Money and Pensions Service, to oversee the development of the dashboard infrastructure. And then Part 5 makes amendments to the scheme funding regime for DB schemes, including to require trustees to have funding and investment strategy for the scheme. It introduces new restrictions on transfers between schemes aimed at protecting members from pension scams, and it retrospectively restores the balance with regard to the calculation of PPF compensation payments, all of which we will pick up slightly later in the presentation this morning. We're going to talk through each of those bits in more detail. Just before I do so, a couple of points worth mentioning following the line-by-line examination of the bill, the draft bill that's been carried out during the committee stage in the Lords. As you'll see, as we pick up a couple of points later on, there has been some concern expressed by peers about the scope of the regulation-making powers that the bill has. A number of the provisions are almost headline only, and say the provisions for detailed dealing will be made in secondary legislation and regulation. As you know, they are subject to significantly less scrutiny than is primary legislation. So there's been some concern expressed through that. We'll pick up a couple of those points later. Without wishing to steal any of Lynette's thunder, the new criminal sanctions in clause 107 of the bill, which I'm sure you've seen reference to in the pensions press, that's an offence of avoiding employer debt and an offence of conduct risking accrued scheme benefits, were debated extensively, and a number of peers expressed concerns about the scope of the new criminal offences, that it goes significantly beyond the original sanction that was proposed in the consultation which preceded the bill. But the government are committed to this, and they feel their aim is, or their stated aim is, to strike a balance between protecting members' benefits and taking taking into account the impact on business. There will be further consultation and details published, or guidance published, by the regulator on its approach to prosecuting new offences. So again, primary legislation is there, but we wait to see some of the detail in this case, guidance from the regulator rather than statutory instruments. So that's something that will continue to run, but I won't say anything more about that. And that I'm sure we'll be picking that up. And then finally on climate change, they've also formed, as perhaps you'd expect in current times, part of the discussion on the progress of the bill. An updated version was published in March, which contained the government's new climate change risk governance duties, and is agreed and will move into committee stage. The Minister confirmed it wasn't the government's intention to direct schemes or set their investment strategies, but it made clear that it was absolutely necessary for trustees to act within their financial duties to protect members' benefits against the risks posed by climate change. So the government intends to, in inverted commas, consult extensively this summer on the content of, again, new regulations to set out the detailed requirements of this governance framework. No real certainty yet about when any such regulations will be laid or come into force, but the government intends to respond within a year of launching the consultation in the summer. So that's going to be some time in the making, and I'm sure will be commented on widely. Moving forward then, I'm going to skip over scheme funding because Lynette is going to, excuse me, cover that. Excuse me. And move to CDC schemes. So I should have said, my apologies, I should have said at the start. I'll be covering CDC schemes, the pension dashboard, changes to transfer regulations, and PPF compensation. And then Lynette will be picking up the regulator powers and scheme funding regime as we go through this. So I've just skipped over those couple of slides, which I hope wasn't too confusing. So looking now at CDC schemes, I'm going to continue to use that acronym, if I may. It's just something that everyone is now comfortable with. As I say, it's not how the schemes are referred to technically in the bill. They are collective money purchase benefit schemes, but nonetheless, let's stick with CDC. It's a phrase that we all have become familiar with, I think. And new legislation is set in Part 1, Part 2 for Northern Ireland of the bill to establish what is a permissive framework for establishment and operation of CDCs. Bill amends various bits of legislation, particularly the Pensions Act 93, to create a new subset of money purchase benefits, which will allow for pooled investment arrangements, which is how CDCs will operate. As many of you will know, CDC issue, certainly in the UK, was brought to the fore by work done between the Royal Mail and the Communication Workers Union, who tried to find an alternative to simply introducing a defined contribution scheme for Royal Mail employees when they had previously enjoyed a final salary scheme situation that obviously has faced a number of employers. And the union, the CW, wanted to explore an alternative to switching simply to place 100% of the risk on members, as would be the case to a standard defined contribution scheme. But Royal Mail, given its size and the scheme, couldn't afford to continue bearing the risk of a final salary scheme. So they came to this compromise of a collective defined contribution scheme. How does it work? Well, there's been no doubt, whilst it includes an element of risk sharing, much more so than in traditional money purchase schemes, CDC schemes don't offer any guaranteed benefits. To quote the provision in the bill, a qualifying benefit from a CDC scheme is one where the rules of the scheme, in quotes, the rate or amount, under the rules of the scheme, quote, the rate or amount of benefit is subject to periodic adjustments designed to achieve a balance between the value of the available assets of the scheme and the required amounts. So in practical terms, benefits from the scheme are targeted, contribution rates are fixed, but the benefit level is a target or estimate. It's not a guarantee. And so where's the difference? And importantly, where's the added value as opposed to a regular money purchase scheme? Well, firstly, pensions are paid from the scheme rather than members needing to purchase an annuity. This takes away a large degree of risk from the individual member, namely investment risk and annuity price risk. CDC scheme will operate in a similar manner to a conventional DC scheme, except that the member will own a proportionate share of the collective scheme assets rather than an individual share. So in a CDC scheme, investment risks are shared amongst the membership, which means investments can remain more liquid as cash is required to pay members. Annuity is generated from the fund of a whole rather than from an individual member's notional pot. At the same time, funds of the CDC scheme are invested, as the name suggests, collectively rather than each member having their own investment pool or pot, which theoretically allows for a more growth-focused investment strategy than may otherwise have been the case for an individual member. But because there's no guarantee, no underwriting from the employer, no pensions promise, then something has to be able to give should the level of assets not meet the level needed to meet targeted level of benefits. If that is the case, then scheme has to be capable, benefits from the scheme have to be capable of being adjusted and, crucially, down as well as up. So where a pension is set at a particular level or targeted at a particular level, if a member's share of the fund isn't sufficient to meet that level of pension, then it may not increase in any one year, and indeed it may decrease. Therefore, members' income in retirement can fluctuate. That's just my way of example to try and sort of put some sort of reality on that. Although it's only a proposal at the moment, the Royal Mail's CDC scheme, as an example, their contribution rates are to be fixed at 15.2%, with 4% being payable by the employer, by the member, I beg your pardon. And they target a level of pension based on 1/80th of a member's pensionable pay each year, in a similar way to what we'd understand a career average scheme to do. And there would be a lump sum payable in addition at retirement. Each year, schemes valued with value of the assets compared to the cost of funding payment of accumulated pensions, as traditionally as we would, fairly traditionally as we would understand in a DB scheme. Whether some headroom in assets over what are in effect liabilities, then increases in pensions may be applied. If it's parity, then in terms of assets over liabilities, then pensions stay as they are. But where there is a in effect deficit of assets over the pensions that have been accumulated, then pensions can be reduced. And initially it's envisaged that that would be a 5% reduction for the coming year, with further calculation and valuation on an annual basis to determine whether or not pensions could needed to be decreased further, or whether or not they could stabilise and or increase going forward. So elements of DB in terms of targeting benefits and relating benefits to salary and length of service, but DC related in terms of reliance on investments and no pensions promise for the employer to be legally obliged to meet. So why are they in the bill? Well, government launched a consultation in October 2018 after the work between the Royal Mail and CWU on its CDC scheme, because in short, they were in favour of the idea. The legislation wasn't in place the framework wasn't in place to allow such a scheme to be introduced. So new primary and indeed secondary legislation is going to be needed to facilitate not just this CDC, not just the Royal Mail's CDC scheme, but also CDC schemes going forward. And the government are quite keen. They see this as quite a key element of future workplace pension provision. So the bill introduces a number of measures. First of all, it amends, as I've already said, the definition of money purchase benefits to include collective money purchase benefit schemes. It doesn't, at the moment, impact on the latest court-determined definition of money purchase schemes, so that's something we might see develop over time, but certainly it amends legislation to allow for collective money purchase benefit schemes as money purchase benefits. It introduces an authorization process and regime whereby CDC schemes are authorized and monitored by the pensions regulator in a similar way to we saw at the end of last year, beginning of this year for master trusts. So the authorization process will be by application to the regulator, who will approve or otherwise any particular scheme, and will then be the body overseeing the ongoing administration of those schemes. So elements to be included. Schemes will have to demonstrate that, or scheme designers, scheme sponsors will have to demonstrate that they are fit and proper persons to run the scheme, that the scheme is of sound benefit design, that there's an adequate communication strategy and process. That's obviously going to be very important to communicate with members, particularly where benefits may be going down, and explain to members how that's going to work and how that will work in practice. And obviously effective administration and governance of the scheme on an ongoing basis. So much a whole new raft of schemes or type of schemes for the regulator to get to grips with. The bill also sets out the schemes will need to be valued by an actuary in a not dissimilar manner to the way in which we know EB schemes to be valued at the moment, and have in place rules governing the rate of targeted benefits and how the required annual amount is to be determined. And the actuary, and it also amends some of the 93 Act, Pension Schemes Act 93, to change and to the requirement for an actuary to calculate CETVs for transfers from CDC schemes. It's faced a little bit of criticism, Bill's faced a little bit of criticism in the fact that it sets out that CDC schemes can be operated either by a single employer or by connected employers. So there'd been some hope that it might be open to wider provision in a similar way to master trusts or decumulation funds. But the government seems to have been quite cautious in its approach to this, and initially will allow only single employer or connected employer entities to operate a CDC scheme, which suggests to us that it's not going to be, at this stage at least, something that's open to small and medium-sized employers. It's probably only going to be open to larger employers who will be able to benefit from it. And crucially, the bill amends Section 67 of the 95 Act because in effect, subsisting rights will need to be, or it's possible that subsisting rights will be detrimentally affected should schemes not be able to pay the level of pension, have sufficient assets to pay the level of pension that they've targeted. So members' pensions in payment could be reduced, not something that is allowed at the moment under the current Section 67 regime. The bill, amendments to the bill are also introduced by the government so that charge control measures can be used for CDC schemes, so as with existing default fund charges capped for DC schemes. Secondary legislation is going to be used to define the details of the cap and how it will apply. So again, further detail waited for in secondary legislation there. So I think generally we're of the opinion that CDC schemes, the structure of CDC schemes is to be welcome, but slight concerns about some of the secondary legislation and the fact that perhaps their impact won't be initially felt as widely as it could be, simply because employers will presumably to be quite large to see the benefit of operating such a scheme. It's not going to be rolled out on a similar basis to master trusts. So let's move on then and look quickly at the pension dashboard, and where time is getting away with us, and I don't want to eat too much more into Lynette's time. Sadly, not too much to say on the progress of the pensions dashboard. The intention is that MAPS, Money and Pension Service, will be the first dashboard provider, but that commercial organisations are also going to follow suit. It seems like something we've been talking about for some considerable time, and everybody had a combination of views, thinking A, it was probably a good idea, but B, struggling to see how it would actually happen. Well, this seems to perhaps underline that. The bill as it stands contains only limited information on the pension dashboard. It does introduce a statutory definition, which is an electronic communication service by means of which information about pensions may be requested by and provided to an individual or person authorised by that individual. So that's nothing different to what I think we were expecting or envisaging. Obviously, in order to provide a PDS, certain regulatory requirements will need to be met. Again, the detail around those are still fairly thin on the ground, but we're expecting them to be about how PDS pension dashboard services will be operated, as well as the type of information that will need to be provided to individuals, and in particular, and this is something that trustees perhaps to start thinking about now, the level of information that they will be required to provide to PDS to provide said information to members. So there could be quite a significant increase in that communication type work with, if pension dashboard services get up and running. And it will be for the regulator to have the power to enforce compliance with these obligations. Again, it's envisaged that a PDS will contain or will include information about a member's state pension, as well as any occupational personal arrangements that the member has in place, with the laudable intention, I guess, of making it easier for members to see all of their pension benefits in one location without having to approach each individual pension provider with who they have a pension, or indeed with who they may have forgotten they have a pension. Bill introduces statutory obligations on trustees of occupational pension schemes to provide the information to any PDSs, and again we wait for secondary legislation to put some flesh on the bones of that. There were some comments about that during the committee stage, debates in the committee stage, about the skeletal nature of some of the primary legislation about pension dashboards. But the government is pushing the idea that we need a degree of flexibility to accommodate changing requirements, particularly technical requirements and user needs in the future. So working on the basis that if things do need to be changed once they're in place, it's much easier to do so through secondary legislation than it is through primary legislation. We had an update in April from MAPS, its first update progress report on the PDS, and it recognized that priorities are going to be focused elsewhere, as everyone else is during the pandemic. But they're intending to produce a progress report every 6 months to keep us updated on how PDS development is working. First report sets out a broad approach and focus for the first phase of their work, and some of the thinking on the scope of dashboards, as well as the type of data that's going to be required from pension providers. So there'll be further consultation and requests for industry views as MAPS progresses through that. So again, one that's going to run for some time, we think. And finally, from me, fairly quickly again, the bill talks about, or the bill provides for amendments to the Pension Schemes Act 93 about circumstances in which occupational or personal schemes may transfer accrued rights to another scheme. And it introduces a new limitation on transfers, such that members can't exercise their transfer rights unless this is statutory transfers, they can't exercise their statutory transfer rights unless they provide information about their place of residence and information about their employment. So I'm sure we've all come across a situation where a member puts trustees in a difficult position of asking for a transfer, having a statutory right to a transfer, but the scheme simply doesn't smell right. It's provided, it's an occupational scheme, maybe provided by an employer that's situated 200 miles away from where the member lives, or similarly residence-wise, and it simply doesn't smell right. But trustees don't have much power to do anything other than sort of raise questions with the member, who can simply the required answers and take the transfer. So in an attempt to try and prevent those sort of scams and liberation exercises, then these new regulations will come into force and will apply to the public sector unfunded public sector schemes too. It's expected to oblige members who are looking for transfer to produce evidence of earnings from a sponsor of the receiving scheme or a residence of place where the scheme is based, or indeed both, to make it harder for bogus occupational schemes to be used with scams. Again, very short on detail, preferring to defer to secondary legislation the bill refers to transfers not being allowed unless prescribed conditions are satisfied. But the relevant section dealing with those prescribed conditions says that they will, and I quote, include but not limited to conditions about the member's employment or place of residence, providing the trustees or managers with information or evidence about the member's employment or place of residence. Kind of full stop. So much more detail required there in second legislation. I think we can happily support the principle, supporting trustees and protecting members at the same time by providing this further detail and allowing trustees to get their teeth into something. But nothing more than that at the moment. And then finally, before I'm sort of wrapping up, before I get to pass to Lynette, just to say that I slipped a slide too far. My apologies. There we go. Just to say that the bill includes measures to counter the impact of High Court decision in being a PPF that members transferred in rights couldn't be aggregated with his rights in the scheme for the purposes of calculating compensation. DWP originally was going to introduce legislation which reversed the impact of that, but they have instead picked up this the opportunity in this bill to provide members who to say and ensure that regulations will be put in place confirming that benefits are not aggregated and will always deem not to have been so. And that, I think, with due apologies for Lynette for talking too much, is me done. And you're on mute, Lynette.
Morning, everybody, again. That was really interesting, Julian. We have had a couple of questions in around CDC schemes. So if we get a chance at the end, we'll loop back to those if that's okay. So I'm going to talk on the whole about two main issues. Frankly, they are to some extent interlinked. And the first of that is DB scheme funding. So essentially, following the government's white paper, which Julian has referred you to, on protecting defined benefit pension schemes, and the subsequent funding statement of 2019 issued by the pensions regulator, the bill does introduce a new duty on trustees, and it makes generally amendments to scheme funding and investment legislation. So going forward, basically, trustees of defined benefit pension schemes will need to determine a funding and investment strategy which is going to ensure pensions and other benefits under the schemes can be provided over the long term. I don't think that's a particularly new message. As I say, I think that is something that we saw in the scheme funding code last year, so it didn't come at all as a surprise that as essentially the pensions regulator sees that schemes are maturing, they see that most of them will in the sort of medium to long term, so over the next 20 years, be winding down and getting into a position where they can be wound up or at least effectively handed over to another arrangement. This need to actually set out that plan now in order to help mitigate risk. In addition to the long-term funding target effectively, trustees are going to be required to come up with a set of technical provisions. So in other words, the assumptions that they make as part of their triennial valuations, which are consistent with that longer term funding objective. So to me, that is definitely going to be something that will encourage trustees to ensure that they set that long-term funding target, they set a journey plan over the next 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it may be, and that will force their mind to do that because there will be an interlink between that longer term plan and the need to effectively set a shorter term triennial sort of objective. So as part of this process, trustees are going to need to prepare a written statement of a funding and investment strategy. So that's going to have to identify whether that strategy has been successfully implemented. So presumably that's obviously not going to be in the first written statement, but in subsequent written statements, and details of the main risks that the scheme is facing, any mitigation action that is being taken by the trustees in respect of those risks, and effectively enter they describe it as a reflection on significant decisions that have been taken by the trustees, presumably again over the preceding year or 3 years, as the case may be. So as part of that development of the statement of strategy, trustees are going to have to consult with the employer around that before they prepare this written statement. Now, unlike the DC chair statement, this isn't something that's going to be needed to be shared with members. This is essentially a document that is going to be tripartite, as between the trustees, the employer, and the regulator. So it's not something that at this stage is going to be shared with members. Whether that might come, I think that is potentially likely, and it might also, to my mind, perhaps lead to a statement, perhaps in the annual report for schemes around these particular issues. Because if trustees have developed these strategies, even though they're not required to share them with members, they may well want to share those with members so that members can see what is being done. Also on scheme funding, before I move on to the interesting topic of the new regulator powers, effectively the regulator started to consult around its new scheme funding code. Part 1 of that consultation is now open. We thought that that was going to close in June, but that consultation, due to the current pandemic, is now open until the 2nd of September. And basically, that covers the kind of the regulatory approach and the principles of this new framework that they're looking to put in place. Essentially, what they're looking to do is to develop some sort of twin track model in terms of the triennial valuations for trustees. So trustees will either be able to go down the fast track option or a more bespoke approach. So effectively, one point to bear in mind is just because in one valuation you decide you're going to go down the fast track route doesn't mean that in the next valuation that you also need to go down that. You can switch and change between valuations. The fast track approach is certainly going to have a lot more around it. There's going to be quite a lot of descriptions as to what you should be doing, and there is even talk around the fact that if you go down fast track, there will be essentially a proposal with regard to the length of your recovery plan. Now, I can only assume that that's going to be based on different types of covenant, because otherwise it would be it's likely that a recovery plan would be very different, even on the fast track approach, for an employer that has a very strong covenant against an employer that might be tending to weak. And indeed, if the regulator were to propose one form of and one length of a recovery plan, I think that goes against some of its other comments within the DB funding code consultation, which suggests that essentially trustees and the regulator will need to take account of actually the ability for employers to continue to grow, to continue to operate, and effectively that recovery plans should be very much geared towards the affordability of the employer. So as part of the DB funding code, our view is that the regulator very much recognises the recognition of schemes maturing, that actually these journey plans will help protect members' benefits whilst allowing employers to grow and to develop. And there is going to be this real focus on looking at risks and for trustees to manage those risks. So we have thought that this scheme funding code would come actually into force by the end of next year, by the end of 2021. But given the pandemic, we think that that's much more likely to now push out into 2022. So moving on to the new powers for the regulator. Again, we as a firm did deliver quite a number of seminars around the white paper when that came out and was published, and our concerns around some of the comments within that white paper. But these powers have been introduced, as Julian mentioned, in the light of corporate activity by the likes of BHS and Carillion, and some general concern that the powers that the regulator had are not sufficient, are not fit for purpose, if you like, for those sort of extremist circumstances in particular. So these have been introduced in order to develop the regulator to allow it to be this clearer, quicker, tougher, which is a message that we've seen several times. So what are the new powers? In my head, they are effectively split into three, if you like, sort of areas. There are some changes to the contribution notice territory. There are then some introduction of some new criminal offences, which Julian has touched on in terms of the fact that there have been some headlines about that and some concerns raised in the House of Lords, also actually in the pensions press and amongst some industry bodies about those. There are then some changes to the notifiable events framework, and indeed some tougher financial penalties that sit alongside all of that. So the stronger regulator powers are contained within Part 3 of the bill, and effectively are going to touch on, first of all, the changes to the contribution notice territory. So contribution notices can be issued by the regulator currently in certain circumstances. The two are that actions or inactions taken by employers or those connected or associated with employers are materially detrimental to scheme benefits or the ability of those to be paid in the future. And the second is that there has been effectively an avoidance of a Section 75 debt in some shape or form. So two new powers are going to be introduced that fit within that framework. And I think that's very important to recognise where they sit, because on that basis, these powers can only be imposed against employers to DB schemes and those people that are connected or associated with those employers. So that would generally be, for instance, parent companies, it may be subsidiaries, it may be their directors, it can be major shareholders, for instance. So although it's quite a wide description of people that can have contribution notice imposed on them, it's not as wide as the simple persons, which I will come on to later with regard to the introduction of new criminal offences. So the two new grounds for imposing contribution notice are the employer insolvency test and the employer resources test. So the employer insolvency test is going to be met where pension scheme is in deficit and had a Section 75 debt fallen due the act or failure that has taken place would have materially reduced the amount of the debt likely to be recovered. And then the employer resources test will be met where there is an act or failure to act which reduces the value of the employer and where the reduction is material, relevant to the Section 75 debt. I have to say that currently it's not clear in that second test what is meant by resources. There isn't a lot of detail around that at all within the Act. So I think that that will be something that the regulator is going to have to issue guidance on to the extent that that is not further developed within the Act. A couple of important things to bear in mind regarding the fact that this still falls within the contribution notice territory is that the regulator can only issue contribution notice where it considers it reasonable to do so. And there are set out currently in the Pensions Act 2004 a number of considerations that it needs to take into account when it looks at whether contribution notices should actually be imposed. Both of these new tests, a bit like the material detriment test, do have a statutory defence. And that defence is effectively that the relevant person has considered the action that they are going to be taking before they take that action, consider the position of the pension scheme and in particular whether what they're doing is going to cause a material reduction in the Section 75 debt, or is it going to reduce the value of the employer, and have decided before they take that action that actually what they're doing is not material, or to the extent that it is, have actually provided some mitigation to that. So I think that is very important that we've got something that's akin to what we already have in terms of the defence to the material detriment test. To my mind, I'm not sure how much additional power these in effect will give the regulator, because it strikes me that if one of these tests is met, it is quite likely the material detriment test, which already exists, would also be met. I touched on the fact that the regulator has to consider certain things when it's looking at imposing a contribution notice, and in the Act there are a number of issues that it has to consider around the reasonableness aspect, and there are two new issues that it has to consider, which have been introduced by the Pension Schemes Bill. The first is that it has to consider the effect of the Act or failure to act on the value of the scheme's assets or liabilities. And the second is that the person's non-compliance, whether they effectively have complied or not with new regulator powers to do with information gathering, which I will touch on in a moment. There is also going to be a new criminal offence or two. So one of them will be a new criminal offence of failing to comply with a contribution notice. That sort of falls within the contribution notice sort of sections of the Act as it currently stands. So effectively, not only, so if you fail to comply with the contribution notice that has already been imposed, there is now going to actually be a criminal offence of failing to do that. And so the regulator can take additional actions, or that can be taken, I believe, by, for instance, the Secretary of State or the Crown Prosecution Service. So moving on to the part of the Act which I think has had the most scrutiny and the most concerns, and that's around the introduction of new criminal offences. Prior to the bill coming into being written and following the white paper, there had been talk about introducing quite stringent offences, but previously the DWP had talked around these being only effectively going to be for the most egregious of actions, so very hot, situations which were quite extreme, really. And there has been concern, though, that these new offences go much beyond what was originally anticipated. Lord Hutton, in particular, has talked around the fact that we thought that these new offences would only be in circumstances where there's been willful or reckless behaviour in relation to a pension scheme. That wording isn't found in the wording of the Act at all. So what the Act actually introduces is two new offences under Section 107 of the Bill, which will form part of the Pension Schemes Act 2004, but doesn't fall within the general remit of contribution notices or even financial support directions. What it actually does is it forms a whole new section, and these offences can be brought against any person. So it's not limited in the same way as contribution notices to persons that are the employer or are connected or associated with the employer. It is very wide. It could therefore catch, arguably, banks or trustees or indeed advisors. And I think that is where some of the issue lies. So what are the offences? So the two new offences are, there's an offence of avoidance of an employer debt. So this applies to any person if, without reasonable excuse, and I will come back to touch on that wording shortly, they act or engage in a course of conduct and intended in that course of conduct is to have effect such that it prevents the recovery of the whole or part of a debt which is due from the employer under Section 75 of the Pensions Act 1995. And the second offence is that a person can be effectively have an action brought against them where an act or a course of conduct, so it's not just one act here, it is a course of conduct as well, detrimentally affects in a material way the likelihood of accrued scheme benefits being received. Provided that that person knew or ought to have known that the act or course of conduct would have that effect, and again, provided that they did not have a reasonable excuse for engaging in such conduct. So if you are found guilty of such an offence, there's an unlimited fine or up to 7 years in prison. Concern has been expressed around what is meant by reasonable excuse. Basically, the DWP has said that there will be detailed guidance that will be brought out by the pensions regulator to discuss that. I think our concern is that guidance doesn't have the same weight as the force of law. So in other words, if this action were brought by, for instance, the Crown Prosecution Service, my interpretation of the Act is that it could be as opposed by the pensions regulator, that, for instance, the courts may or may not take account of that guidance. You'd like to think that, given that it was issued by the pensions regulator, it would be taken account of, but guidance does not have the same weight, as I say, as law or even secondary legislation. So I think there is some concern around that, and rightly so. There has been talk by the Association of Pension Lawyers, for instance, which obviously shoots me apart, that this could, particularly the second offence of conduct risking accrued scheme benefits, that could apply to banks refusing to support employers. Could it apply to employers giving their employees a pay rise? Could it apply to scheme trustees giving better scheme factors where they haven't got monies coming in from the employer to cover that? Is that conduct that detrimentally affects in a material way the likelihood of accrued scheme benefits being received? So it is only talking about likelihood. Fortunately, it does talk around material, but as a lawyer, there's no real definition of material, and people have different views on that. and there has been previous case law that talks around material as being, very small swings in likelihood in this instance. So, maybe 5% or so. So the defence of reasonable excuse, as I say, is not overly clear, and we just have to wait and see what will come of that. I personally would like to see a much better definition of reasonable excuse within the Act itself, so it forms part of the legislation, very much like the list of reasonable items the pensions regulator has to consider when it's deciding to impose a contribution notice. But given that the House of Lords have asked for clarity around this, and that has been dismissed currently by the DWP, I think we just have to wait and see what happens here, unfortunately. One would hope that if prosecutions were being led by the pensions regulator, that they would take a very similar approach to they do when considering whether to impose contribution notices. And one would hope that these offences can only be imposed in very difficult situations, egregious circumstances, as were originally referred to by the DWP. So in addition, a couple of new other powers that have been introduced, and I think again these follow on from the experience that the regulator had, particularly on the BHS case, where it struggled to get information from relevant parties in that case, and they're going to be granted much more extensive powers and sanctions in respect of their ability to collate and request information. And they're going to actually be able to interview people, so request for people to come to be interviewed, and they are also going to be actually able to go into people's premises and gather information if that's what they feel they need to do. One thing that hasn't been covered are some of the details to the proposed changes to the notifiable events regime. We are expecting those to be in regulations. There is power given in the bill to allow that to take place, but not yet the detail in it. So I don't propose to go into that in any great detail. I think there is some concern, and again, I think it's been expressed in the House of Lords around whether that will capture the ability for companies to give dividends and other distributions to its shareholders, but we don't yet know. I think that there are sort of two sides to that, in terms of the fact that employers may well want to reward their shareholders and be allowed to do so, but it comes down to the equality of treatment position that the regulator is talking around, and is particularly talking around in its new scheme funding code, in its new annual funding statement that came out recently, which generally focuses on obviously the short to medium term issues arising from the pandemic, but does carry on its previous messaging around the need to have equality for distributions. And the other point to touch on are these tougher financial penalties, which are going to be capable of being imposed where there's been a failure to comply with a contribution notice, or there's been an avoidance of an employer debt, or where there's been this knowingly or recklessly providing false information or misleading information to the regulator. And there, the fines can be relatively hefty now, of up to £1 million. So, as I say, I've already talked around some of the implications of the new powers, and I'm very conscious that we're already over time from where I think our revised suggestion that we try and stick to an hour. And I think we just will need to consider and talk through in more detail, these concerns about the breadth, particularly of these two new criminal sanctions that fall outside of the contribution notice territory have the ability that they can apply to very many people, including trustees, you know, and in circumstances where they are trying to do the right thing. Now, one hopes that where people are trying to do the right thing, that would fall within reasonable excuse territory, even if ultimately there is some form of detriment to the pension scheme. One can't be expected to always crystal ball gaze. But until we have that detail, I think the pensions industry is right to be concerned that this could change people's way of acting and could effectively, I'm a lawyer and I obviously like to talk about the law, but it shouldn't just be about the law. It should be around making sure that the best member outcomes are achieved and the best financial outcomes pension schemes, and particularly DB pension schemes, are concerned. In addition to the concerns around the effect of these new criminal sanctions and contribution notice territory, there's also been some concerns around other issues that are contained within the bill. So, for instance, the House of Lords also expressed concern around the fact that the DWP will have powers under regulation to be able to effectively impose conditions upon who can be chair of trustees, and I think the House of Lords feels that that's possibly a little bit a step too far, and that it's right that, for instance, the regulator tries to give some substance as to the knowledge and understanding that trustees and trustee boards should have, and that there should be some need for perhaps some exams to be undertaken by professional trustees, but it thought that this was just going too far. So I just want to basically reiterate that there are many concerns. We will keep abreast of this as the bill progresses. As Julian alluded to, we're not quite sure really at the moment how quickly that's going to happen. At some point during, I think, March, the bill changed its name from 2019 to 2020 to 2019 to 2021, effectively acknowledging the fact that things weren't going to progress as a result of the pandemic during the course of this year. So we will keep an eye on how things do develop. We will, I think, as through particularly in some of the industry bodies, the PLSA, the PMI, the Association of Pension Lawyers, I think there needs to be some continuous lobbying around some of these issues that I've mentioned, particularly the breadth of the new criminal offence and the concept of reasonable excuse. But not sure whether obviously that's going to have as much traction as we would like. So as I say, no date yet set for its next stage. We really think there will be some further disruption, and just not clear where we're going to get to because we're a long way off yet getting royal assent. I think when we first trialled these seminars as our sort of spring seminar discussions, we thought that we would be a lot further on in this progress. So it's just unfortunate as to circumstances. So a couple of questions. Julie and I will perhaps if you could unmute so that we could answer them. We've had a question around CDC schemes, which I'll leave you perhaps in a moment to talk about. Yep. I had an earlier question around effectively this idea around how, if the wording on the criminal offences continues, how we think the regulator will effectively use those powers. And as I've already alluded to, I'm not quite sure yet. I would say, though, that my experience generally around the regulator using the powers it has with regard to contribution notices and financial support directions has been that the regulator doesn't go in all guns blazing and just impose these penalties, these notices. It will, in the first instance, always try and get the parties to work together and try to come to a solution if at all possible. Now, in sort of these very difficult circumstances where people frankly are reckless, then it strikes me that that sort of action won't help, whereas so therefore people who are effectively guilty of that sort of reckless behaviour, perhaps it is appropriate that the regulator can impose those sort of sanctions, whereas notwithstanding the fact that the wording of the Act might capture people who don't mean to obviously cause harm to pension schemes and effectively by accident, perhaps with all good intent, do cause harm, then one would hope that that idea of working together that the regulator has used so far would continue. There is also a question around, is a DB chair's statement a good idea? Just trying to read the full question if I can. Says it is a DB statement, the chair's statement for Master Trust experience has resulted in a huge amount of unfriendly reports to the pensions regulator and no benefit to members. I think this means something separate to the statement that is already going to have to be made in terms of the long-term funding target, which will just be between employers and trustees, and the regulator, which is really driving at making sure the TPs are aligned to that long-term funding target, and also that effectively there is effectively a flight path to get somewhere, and that is managing risks. So I think this is looking at more like the DC statement, which I agree. I'm not convinced a DB chair statement is the right thing. I wouldn't want to see it as effectively a box ticking exercise. I think sharing approach to, for instance, risk, to the extent that that's not already provided within the statement of funding principles, maybe. But I personally, I agree. I wouldn't want this to just be sort of just going through points for the sake of it almost. That would not really add any value to members. Over to you, Julian, around CDC schemes, if I may.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. If pensions can be reduced, what protection is there for retired members if the people who manage the funds are not good at their jobs in investing? For those of us who are trustees, that'll bring a fairly wry smile to faces. In short, there isn't anything within the legislation proposed that says that focuses particularly on that. I guess it's a two-strand approach. Firstly, it will be for the regulator, both in the initial authorization phase and in the ongoing monitoring phase, which will include scheme valuations and reports on investments, to engage, to use that phrase, with trustees and scheme providers on how things are running. And one would imagine if over time a scheme was not performing to the extent that, with the implication that members' pensions were being reduced, then it would have something to say about that. But I suspect, again, unfortunately for those that are trustees, it's going to be yet another thing for scheme trustees to worry about. We all are actively involved with investment consultants and our investment managers on how the investments are both divided up in terms of asset allocation and what the risk profile is and what the actual investments are in terms of the type of funds they're invested in. to maintain. This will just be, and I don't mean to belittle it, but this will just be yet another pressure on the trustees to pressure their investment, get the right investment managers, get the right asset allocation, get the right set of investment principles and the right strategy to make sure that that things don't underperform to the extent they have to go through and reduce members' pensions. I guess they've been slightly, only very slightly protected in the past in that for a DB scheme, if investments don't perform, then the employer is legally there to step in and make sure those pensions those liabilities are funded. In a DC scheme, it's an individual pot, and you kind of, there's a separation between the trustees and the members. Well, there's your pot, and what it will buy when retirement is what it will buy when it comes to retirement. But this will be an active decision by trustees and providers to whether or not they have to, on an actuarial advice, reduce down pensions that are in payment. So it's quite a substantial additional pressure on trustees, but I think that's where it's going to lay, and I'm sure the regulator will follow up with not increased, that's the wrong word, but additional guidance for trustees on how to do proper monitoring. We've seen the stuff that came out last year about how to properly engage with investment consultants, and the number of trustees don't do so, and how to properly engage with fiduciary managers because a number of trustees don't do so. I think that can only increase if we, as and when we go down the road of CDC schemes being more prevalent.
Thanks, Julian. I had a comment, an observation has come in, which I thought I would share because I think it's a good observation. And this are the two new contribution notice tests, which refer to the impact. So that's both they're effectively measuring the employer insolvency and the employer resources test immediately after the action. And that immediately after bit isn't in the current material detriment test, and whether that effectively makes this those two tests more stringent than a current material detriment test, which could arguably just be looking at things in the longer term. I can see that, and I can agree with that. I do actually think, though, that well advised employers, hopefully including us, I obviously advise quite a lot of employers as well as trustees, would look at that, have looked at that material detriment test, not only in the longer term, but also, you would ask your employer clients, if they were carrying out some action, please make sure that you look at the position immediately before the action, position immediately after, and also look to the future. So I think probably well-advised schemes would already be looking at that immediately after picture, but perhaps this helps to bring that to the fore, which I think is more what this is about in my head, is making sure that people are capturing the right actions and are considering the right actions as being potentially materially detrimental, where perhaps the current wording isn't as clear as the new wording might be. So thank you, that's really helpful observation. So I think that's probably everything. What I think we will do is we will firstly happy to share these slides with those people who have participated this morning, and we will arrange that to happen. And then secondly, we will try and summarise the answer to the questions that have been raised during the course of this morning's webinar, and include them when we circulate the slides. We will, as I said, be continuing to monitor things as they go on. We obviously are constantly putting news items onto our website, so do keep an eye on the pensions part of that website. We are now putting on both sort of longer and shorter articles, and sort of we might just put on bite-sized pieces as and when we hear it. So please do look there, and we will perhaps, it may be appropriate at some point when we can all get back together to have some roundtable discussions about some of these issues and to actually bounce those off across a number of professionals and trustees from all sorts of backgrounds as to actually the impact it might have on how they will operate going forwards. So may I take this opportunity to thank all of you very much for listening this morning. So that you know, this has been the first webinar I've ever delivered. Probably am better in the flesh. I like to move around, so apologies if I am a little bit of a fidget. But I would like to thank you all personally and also on behalf of Shoesmiths. And please, everybody, stay safe and take good care of yourselves. That's the most important thing at this current time.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.